Everybody wants things to improve, but nobody likes change.
I think the time is actually quite ripe for augmenting creativity, but also shortening this bridge between humans and machines.
We don't really have ready access to our information. It's scattered, it's kept in different places.
You can remember something. It's really difficult then to go and utilize that information. Even though we have this wonderful access, we couldn't have had it.
With AI, you can iterate something that might take an entire human lifetime.
Do your reading, do what's natural to you as a human. And then what we're doing is storing all of that for you for when it's relevant and it's connected for you, right? With AI, we can think of it as, I call it an evolutionary boost.
Well, now we've got one of the biggest levers in at least my lifetime.
Loosen your focus, let your mind wander. As a scientist by training, we're trained really to think nothing is true. It's always going to be disproven.
Well, hello, everyone. It's Jim O'Shaughnessy with yet another Infinite Loops. I have been looking forward to today's guest for quite some time because she's designed something that I think is going to become a really dominant idea in the future, and that is how AI can help expand and enhance and amplify human creativity. My guest is Alice Albrecht, who, wow, PhD in Cognitive Neuroscience from Yale. My daughter went there, and so I know the campus well. Postdoc work at Berkeley, where I started out. Wow, we're just very simpatico here. And the founder and CEO of Recollection. You got inspired by a quote from the neurosurgeon Vivian Ming, who said, "You have 7 lives, and they're all about 7 years long. So you better figure out what you're going to be doing for your next 7. And you came up with Recollect. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me.
So Recollect essentially is what you're trying to do is harness AI to build new things, not just automate workflows, but amplify human creativity. I think that's one of the greatest use cases for AI. Talk to me about Recollect and how you got the idea, and walk us through your origin story of both the company and yourself.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, my background originally was in cognitive neuroscience, and then I left academia in 2014 and got into tech and did lots of machine learning work. And through that time, I'm sort of obsessed with this idea that we can use these technologies to augment humans. We can learn a bunch about the way that their minds work, and then figure out ways either to assist them or augment them with those technologies. And so I love that you found that quote about Vivian Ming. She really was impactful. And I feel like when I went to start Recollect, I had done the academic route and I learned a ton and loved that. And then I'd done the sort of working in tech and growing up with data as a thing in tech for those about 7 years or so. And so for Recollect, we're really focused on, like you said, augmenting human creativity. And even sort of deeper than that, as the field has been advancing so quickly, I think the time is actually quite ripe for augmenting creativity, but also shortening this bridge between humans and machines, with the goal of saying, how do we create these sort of cyborgs that are human first, use this technology to be more creative and do more creative thinking. And so what we're building right now are the very initial stages of that with Recollect. How do we take all the stuff that the things you read, how do we help you connect those the way your mind would? So using these biological models to inform that. And then how do we bring that to you in times and in ways where we can boost that creative thinking, we can boost your divergent thinking, or at least we can help you cope with the deluge of information that you have access to or that you're confronted with, so you can make some space to do that thinking.
Yeah, you make a point in talking about the fact that information, everyone kind of thinks information, we're in the information age, we're moving into a different age, but you make a very good point, which is, we don't really have ready access to our information. It's scattered, it's kept in different places, and I'd like you to elaborate on that point, because when I saw that when I was researching for our conversation, I was like, that is a really good point that I would not naturally come up with. So elaborate and amplify that a little bit.
Yeah. So I think right now we're faced, and the lens I usually use for this is kind of an evolutionary one, right? So I know how our minds work in the space that we adapted. This space is very different. And so right now we have access to information we would not have had access to before. So we have access, even now, you I are in different places. We're having a conversation. I'm getting information from you. I couldn't have gotten that without all this technology. So we have access to that kind of information and a ton of it, and it's very scattered. So I think as soon as we put things behind these rectangles in our computers, so they're very handy. I have lots of physical books and things, but I don't have to carry those with me everywhere. And I can't really search over those unless I remember, oh yes, it was this book around this part of the book, and I can go find a highlight or a quote or something. So we have all of this access all of a sudden when we put things inside of the machines and when we have the internet, but it is quite scattered once you start stuffing it places. And I think people tend to collect information. They put it maybe in some sort of aspirational storage system for themselves, kind of like a file cabinet, but a really hidden one. And I honestly don't think our minds can reason about this information when it's in that format. So it's effectively invisible. It's not physical anymore. There's way too much of it. And it does get really lost and scattered for people. So even if you can remember something, and I have a pretty poor memory, it turns out, for sort of proper names and, what exactly was that thing. It's really difficult then to go and utilize that information, even though we have this wonderful access we couldn't have had before.
You bring up memory, and you also talk about that quite a bit, and that's something that I've always been fascinated with. I'm lucky in that I have a very good memory. For anything I read, I can kind of look up and I can see the page.
Right.
But I have a horrible memory for things I hear or, conversations like this. I'll remember some keywords, and my notes help me because if I write it out, that helps me remember it. But I also have this theory, and I'd love your opinion on it. And that is that, and you've got the PhD, so I'm going to defer to you. I have this idea that we tend to unconsciously and unknowingly upgrade our memories to things that we believe now. And the reason I came to this theory was I've been keeping journals for 40 plus years. And I was having a conversation about, I think it was the first Gulf War back in 91 under the original George Bush Sr. And at this conversation, which was a few years ago, everyone was saying, well, yeah, I supported that war because it was ridiculous that they invaded Kuwait and everything else. And I said, yeah, so did I. And I was going through a journal around that time period, and I found I was called a liar in my own handwriting because I did not support that war. In fact, I was vehemently against it. And this is what I wrote at the time. Am I right about that? Does that happen to our memory?
Yeah. So there's something called a recency bias in memory. And so the things that happened more recently are more memorable. We also actively rewrite our memories all the time. So they're really not very reliable. We could remember facts, which I think are different than episodes. And when we try to remember episodes, what happens is when new information comes in, it kind of overwrites that. And so there's lots of other psychological mechanisms that come into play there. We like to, if we keep a view now that we didn't keep 20 years ago, we're more likely to rewrite that memory with our current view because we sort of can't put ourselves easily back into that 20-year ago version. So memories are very slippery when we think about, oh, this thing happened to me, or that movie I saw even. And some people, like you said, you have this sort of visual memory for things that you've read. That makes a lot of sense. Some people have a really strong memory. Very few, actually, though, this very photographic memory, it sounds like you have. But there are sort of, when we say memory, it's a much broader category, and it interacts with attention, it interacts with our mood, and it interacts with time in these super interesting ways.
Yeah, and I'd like to go deeper on that because it seems to me that there is a link between creativity and memory. In that, so for example, somebody on Twitter last night was talking about memorizing a poem. And when I was a kid, nerd alert, I memorized like 100 poems. Now, the reason that I did that was my father had done it, and I thought it was really cool that he could like recite all these poems. But one of the things that I found that I wasn't anticipating is like, because of those poems, right, in my memory, I'd see a line like, the world is too much with us late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers, little we see in nature that is ours. And that makes me think, oh, and then it connects to another idea and another idea and another idea. And is the idea of Recollect that you're going to try to kind of amplify that using the AI?
Yeah, in a sense, that's what we're doing right now, really, is that we're trying to take all of these memories. And the example you use is great because the things you would connect that same line to now are different than when you first encountered it. So you've got a much richer memory bank now. And so we actually, some of the ways we model this are through graphs, which is incidental. But if we think about walking from one node to another in a graph, right, and we spread that out, the idea here is that these connections that I would make to the same poem and the connections you would make, all the stuff connected to that is different. And so when we think about boosting memory, or boosting creativity rather, we can think about going a few steps out on that graph. So the connection you make now to that poem or to the phrases in that poem are going to be different, and they may not make sense to me. Like if I saw it, I could visualize those connections. I might be like, I don't understand. These things don't fit together. But you have a framework for that. And so that's a superpower that we as humans have, which is when we're trying to solve a problem, when we're trying to write a poem or create something, especially, what we're doing is this very natural process of, oh yeah, this and this should fit together. And then we manipulate that in some way and we share it with somebody else. And that's our idea. And it could be something that only I could think of because of the exposure I had or how my memories were connected. But with Recollect, what we're doing right now is trying to connect all that information for you. And then when you recall it, we bring you back really what's very related. So you don't like, I can never get this thing back. So that specific poem might come back if you were thinking you wrote something about that. But we bring you things that are sort of related too. So we kind of push the boundaries on this graph for the serendipity and see if we can spark something that would have been hard to replicate otherwise. And so as we refine those models, we get better and better at making those connections. And I think for me, that's a good starting point for people. But memory in and of itself, it really is a foundation for a lot of other things we need to do too.
Yeah, and you also make the point that the idea that to enhance your creativity, what you ought to do is when you're exploring new ideas, make sure that there's some overlap with ideas that you already know about. I liked that. In fact, I think reading your stuff, it was the first time I'd ever seen that explicitly stated, which, I guess, and I kind of thought about how I do things. And I'm like, that I didn't even realize that's what I was doing.
Yeah.
But one idea led to an adjacent idea. But then I'm a love to dive down rabbit holes, and so like I jump in, and talk a bit about that. So somebody listening, watching us, they want to become more creative. I've had a lot of conversations with people who really kind of believe that creativity is something that's innate. So I would love your opinion on that because I don't agree with that. But I want to hear what you have to think about that.
Yeah. And sort of like stepping backwards from that, I think it is innate in that we're all innately capable of creativity, right? So I don't believe that anybody is not creative. I think that we minds are set up to learn language innately, and we're set up to creatively solve problems innately so that we can survive in the world. And if we couldn't do that, we wouldn't really survive. And so I think creativity is a loaded term for lots of people where they think like, oh, I'm too analytical. There's all of this like nuance around this idea, but I think you can increase your creativity. You can do things to give yourself more opportunity for creative thinking rather. One of them is consumption or interacting with ideas. Like you said, oh, I have this piece, and if I have something that's slightly adjacent to it, I can more easily attach it, right, to my memory. And then I have a bigger tree to navigate to find creative ideas. And And so I think, consuming ideas, consuming broad ideas, but also sort of making those connections as you go is one thing you can do to reinforce that. So I do this a lot. I'll be reading something. It could be I read like 4 or 5 books around the same time, right? And it could be completely unrelated. It could be a book I'm reading to my kids even. And I'm like, oh, this is it. And I'll write it in the margin. And I'm sort of like, yes, this is the same idea in a different format, right? Or like something is the same here. And so for me, that helps me to just broaden all the time. So I feel like that's one of the biggest things. And then the other is, which is unfortunate right now, you can't be hyper-focused. So this rabbit holing is great, which is actually not really hyper-focused. Sometimes it can get to that. But if you get so narrow that you're really only really thinking about one thing really hard, like in a difficult way, it can be harder to come up with a creative solution. You have to step away from that, loosen your focus, let your mind wander. And in that internal mind wandering, what it's doing is kind of picking about this tree and looking for those connections. And then they come together and you're walking down the street and you're like, oh, I figured it out. So I think managing your time, managing your space in that way is also really important to increase that creative work.
Yeah, something I started doing a long time ago after reading about it was, well, first off, I tried to like meditate endlessly, and I failed. I was an abject failure at it. So then I came across this other book where he was saying, you just sit quietly for 15 or 20 minutes in a room. Make sure there's no stimuli. So there's no music, there's no phones, there's no electronics or books or no open books. And just sit. You can have your eyes open, you can have your eyes closed, doesn't matter. That's all you've got to do. And so I tried that. And first couple of weeks, I felt like an idiot because I'm like, well, I'm just sitting here. But then it really did unlock what you just talked about, which is not a lot happened during the time, but I did find that like when I was out for a walk or I was in the shower or whatever, bam, like there came the solution. Is there some kind of underlying process in our brains that explains why that is so?
It's interesting. I think there's these different phases, right? So there's, if you think about it as a system where you're bringing information in, that one, you want to be kind of focused for, so you're not just like completely all over the place. But the one where you're actually coming up with the ideas, and I think in the article you found, like I talk about these different networks that come on and off for us, and they're coming on and off all of the time. But when you want to put these ideas together, I think you don't want to be in this very like high executive functioning, very focused kind of state. And the other way we can think about this is sleep, right? So in sleep, we're taking all these memories from the day, we consolidate them, they come together in these bizarre ways in dreams. And so that really is the most obvious manifestation of this creativity, where you're like, what the heck? Why did those two things go together? And you don't have this other network on top of that, this sort of control network going like, this isn't relevant, this is bizarre. But I think as we get older, we get better at kind of managing those different states. I think children are really awful at it, which is very amusing, where you hear them and you're like, fascinating. I don't know what's happening anymore. But they're sort of like freely floating between these different states all the time.
I just was lucky enough to be on a vacation with all of my grandchildren. I have 5. And they range in age from nearly 10 to just like 9 months. And my 3-year-old granddaughter is in that phase right now that you just mentioned. And I just love it. I just can love watching her and the way she comes up with things. And I'm trying to figure it out. I'm like, Langdon, why do you think that? And then she'll take this very circuitous path when she's trying to explain to me why she said what she said. And I do find that fascinating. I did talk to one neuroscientist who basically said, for the first maybe 5 years of life, it's basically like the child is on psychedelics all the time. So let's bring AI into it. Because, one of the things that excites me about AI is it's kind of the ultimate replicator iterator. Right. With AI, you can iterate something that might take an entire human lifetime to do. Talk to me about how that is going to fit into Recollect and how that's going to help.
It's interesting. Yeah. So the thing I think about AI is that, or machines and AI, right? Like they have this eidetic memory. They have perfect memory for things unless something fails in the machine. And they have unlimited time and can just crank away at these computations that we would get too tired or bored and walk off from, right? So that's a huge strength. The human piece of that, though, is that we have this creativity and we have this sort of these goals and these things in mind. And so when I think about bringing those two things together, what I want to do is find the strength in each and find that connecting point. And so we could feed a bunch of information to an AI and say, combinatorially, just put the stuff together at, a bajillion times, and then we get all of these ideas, right? But the machine in that sense has no idea why, and it couldn't. It doesn't have a goal. It's missing this rich context of my entire life, right? Of all this information. I know that, this should or shouldn't go together for these reasons. And so I think this question comes up a lot with AI, which is, is it creative? Can it be creative? I think the word, again, is too overloaded to answer that question. But I think that when we talk about using AI or humans using AI for these things, I think if we can get to a place where the human is really the one setting the goal, has the motivation, is really thinking about something, and then can leverage the system that can quickly spin through lots of different simulations of things and say, and it has a probability distribution that makes sense, right? So given this, millions of ideas, it turns out it should be able also to tell me how probable are each of these, right? And then you can have this nice symbiosis where the human is able to push the direction, push the goal, and then correct these things. And then we can use the machine to spin these up, which should help decrease the fatigue for the human, I think, is the way I think about it.
Yeah, and we are very much aligned on our way of thinking about AI, because that's kind of how I think about it. I think that it's just one of the CEOs for one of our portfolio companies at O'Shaughnessy Ventures basically says AI is an infinitely scaling grad student, but with his implication that what you as the professor are directing that grad student, and you are saying, hey, I really want you to go find all of this for me. And my idea is that AI is going to, at least for the foreseeable future, is going to be an incredible tool for human beings to use to amplify their own creativity. But I stress tool, right? Yeah. So for example, can I point an AI at a bunch of really interesting scientific work and say, find the patterns, right? And I think, that's going to be really interesting, but it's going to be up to me to, once I am presented with that data, say, no, this doesn't make any sense. Okay, this is what I was looking for, right? And on the idea of can AI be creative, I'm a big fan of David Deutsch, the author of The Beginning of Infinity and The Fabric of Reality. He's a quantum physicist at Oxbridge. And anyway, he agrees with you. He thinks that AI itself is not creative, right? It's we who are the creative aspect or spark here. And why I'm so excited, and it seems like why we're mutually excited, is that with machine learning, wow, we now have this incredible, like Archimedes, give me a lever and I can move the world. Well, now we've got one of the biggest levers in at least my lifetime, I think. Do you agree? Do you think that AI is probably revolutionary in that aspect, at least?
I think so. I've been doing machine learning stuff since about 2010. And so we called it AI off and on. I think that the models that we have now are really new and very exciting. I think that they open up a lot of possibilities for things that we couldn't do before with these machine learning models. I think it is going to be a huge shift in the technology space. But I think there's going to be other components to it that like we've stepped away from a little bit in the excitement over at least generative AI right now. One of those components is sort of the hardware aspect of this in terms of there's lots of data that you can point machine learning to, and it can do lots of interesting things with that data. And so, in what we're building at Recollect, we're focused right now on connecting all of these pieces of information for an individual in this very personalized way, and that uses a lot of machine learning models. But I think what we'll see as maybe even a bigger tipping point is when we start to see a couple of areas that are still a little too far off from each other start to converge. So one thing I'm really excited about is taking, biometric data from an individual and understanding what I attend to. So a lot of my time in academia and out is focused on this idea of attention in different ways. But if we take that as an example, right? So if we take the hardware getting better, right? We're getting better sensors. It's easier to do these things on device. We were already on that path. We take machine learning models that are also getting better at analyzing this information and finding patterns in it and being able to classify, oh, are you attending to this? Are you not? Is your mind wandering right now? And then we take that and attach it to these other models. It's not necessarily just AI anymore. What we're doing is taking these models, lots of different kinds of models, and figuring out how do we attach the human to what the model knows. So how would we use that human attention to guide the model then? And my presumption is that will dramatically decrease the size of the models very quickly. So when we talk about, it could generate 1 million ideas, but it doesn't know which one to. If it knew what I attended to generally, and then it used that as a way to focus that in, instead of coming up with 10,000 or 1 million options, and then I look at them, right? We could get really focused really fast. So I think we'll start, I think we are at this tipping point. I think AI is a huge piece of it. But I think we'll have advances in different fields that are spurred by the use of AI. And then we'll have this combination, I think, of greater insight into the human sort of physiological state as a way to connect to these things. And at that point, we have probably a more efficient and controllable system, which could be huge, I think.
Yeah, my friend Brian Romelli calls it intelligence amplification. And I get frustrated sometimes when I see people reacting very negatively to AI. And I think it's, and obviously I should check my priors here, because my priors are like, it's a tool. And, are you afraid of a hammer? Are you afraid of a screwdriver? And I understand that that's an unfair way to put it. But what do you think about that? Why do you think that we have this significant minority of people, by the way, many of them very, very intelligent people? So let's not try to strawman them here, who are so kind of terrified of AI just in general. Why do you think that is?
I think one of the scary parts of this narrative is the runaway superintelligence, which
AGI, yeah.
Well, it's actually beyond AGI. So AGI is really just meeting human intelligence is really the goal of AI. Beyond that is the superintelligence, which we haven't hit. And I think there was a piece I wrote coming out on Monday about this. But I've been thinking a lot about why are people freaked out? The same question, right? And do they need to be so scared of a runaway superintelligence that is purely AI? I don't think we need to be scared of it right now. And I think that the reason they're scared at the heart of it is they can't imagine what it does. So if I told you it wasn't AI, but I said, I don't know, a box monster was coming, right? And the box monster does things you can't understand, right? Or it sees things you can't see, or it can produce things that you can't. You, as a human, if it's actually super intelligent, may not be able to understand what's happening. And so I think this unknown is what's really scary to people, and a lack of morality, right? So if it's not a human-first superintelligence, and it can be either. It could be machine superintelligence that happens, or it could be a human or a bunch of humans together collectively as an intelligence that gets augmented to superintelligence, right? And so if we have only this machine superintelligence, I think the fear is it doesn't care. It's not bound by social norms. It's not bound by evolutionary constraints, so it doesn't have to eat or worry about getting food or resources that way. And also, I think people tend to anthropomorphize this technology to a huge extent because going back to the evolutionary piece, we can't conceive of something that talks and is not human. It just doesn't exist. So we immediately ascribe humanness to a thing that can use language this way.
Yes, and that's why I'm excited. I don't know whether I don't know the state of it. I actually haven't looked into it, but this idea that potentially we could use machine learning to see if other animals actually have languages. Whales and dolphins were the ones that were mentioned in the piece I was reading. And do you think let's hypothetically say, let's say that we had an AI that translated whale or translated dolphin. Do you think that that would actually soften this link that humans have between anything that talks as a human? If all of a sudden we learned, oh, goodness, whales have been talking to each other for a long time, it seems, maybe it's not just human. Or do you think that we would stick with our human-centric view of like the ability to use language?
So that's a very interesting question. I think that we would broaden the bubble to be, oh, it's a human, to be that it's an animate thing. And we ascribe a lot of feelings to animate things. Animals that, and we ascribe lots of feelings and emotions, and we think they're conscious, right? We think they have conscious experience that if we could just translate, maybe they could describe to us, or maybe their conscious experience is so different because of the way they see the world, it doesn't overlap enough. But yeah, I think we would still be in this loop of animate versus inanimate, which is a machine. And I think that it would be the interesting crossover is if we have humanoid robots that have AI function, in terms of the functionality, and they look more human, right? And we treat them as such, then it gets even trickier. Yeah, I don't know how our minds would cope with that.
Yeah. Getting back to the machine superintelligence, it seems like people, I like and read Nick Bostrom, for example, and he seems to be kind of augmenting, softening his view. Like he was very worried about machine superintelligence. And in recent interviews that I've seen with him, he seems to be walking it back a little. Do you agree?
I haven't seen recent interviews. I know his work. Yeah, I don't know if everybody's going to walk it back. I don't know if Kurzweil is going to walk this back. Like, I don't know who that has been beating this drum of, oh, we're going to get this runaway superintelligence. It's going to be maybe terrible or maybe amazing. Like, there's other people that are like, maybe it's going to be amazing. Like, I think the walking back, yeah, I think it makes sense to walk back a little bit now that it's less unknown. If we take the fear being that it's unknown and we get to know a little bit of it, right? We feel like we're on a path towards it with the AI we have right now, and that feels not so bad. And so maybe you could reframe the next step, right, into the unknown as being maybe not so bad. We're getting evidence we're building up, right? We're information processing machines here, and we're like, well, that didn't go terribly wrong yet. So maybe the next little step isn't going to be terribly terrible. But yeah, there's still that fear there, I think.
And you mentioned just a moment ago the idea that potentially the superintelligence could be humans plus machines. Right. And I remember a quote that I read that I thought was really interesting about us, about we humans. And it went something like, if you drop a single human naked and alone in a forest, what you've done is provide a very tasty meal for all of the animals in that forest. If you drop 10 humans naked into that forest, you've introduced a new super predator, apex predator to the forest. In other words, we humans, the reason we became the apex predators of this planet is because we can coordinate, we can chunk thinking, we can assign tasks, we can do all of those things. Do you see that happening? Mm-hmm. Throwing machine learning AI into the mix with humans?
I do. So I think there's two pieces there. One is individual human gets thrown into nature or into a terrible situation, and we can use different technologies, probably powered by AI, right, to give them kind of superpowers, right? If we gave them something that could let them hear frequencies they can't hear normally, that's augmenting them. And maybe that gives them an edge on the predators that are kind of creeping out of the bushes at them. And we could call that a super intelligence, right? Anything above the smartest human right now is a super intelligence. And then we've got that, right? But I think once we get people collectively together, that's absolutely right. We are apex predators right now because we are able to communicate and share this information. We're also able to coordinate and work together in these ways. And so I think if we think about a bunch of machines and we say machines coordinate with each other, it's going to be very different in its nature than a bunch of humans that are augmented in these different ways trying to coordinate together. And I also think that we can use machine learning to figure out better ways to connect the humans even, right? So not even these individual, I keep making hand gestures no one can see, but like I'm thinking of like extra parts of your body, like appendages, right? Like those are the augmentation. But really we have this system that like, even with what we're building right now, I think about this a lot. Like we're connecting all of the stuff I know and my notes and things. What if we took my graph and your graph and we see, oh, there's all this overlap here, but here's where it's different, right? And we wanted to coordinate for this podcast and think about some things. That would be a way we could use the machine learning to increase our individual intelligence levels. Even if we're going to communicate, it gives us another layer. And it sort of highlights for us, oh, these are the areas where you're related. Here's where you're not. Here's where the sort of outside of that is. And it can help us find other individuals that have useful information for us, right? If we're trying to coordinate in a group of 100, I may not know that somebody over there has something really important that I need to know. And so I think that collective intelligence is probably a form of super intelligence. I would go on a limb and say like, yes, that meets the definition on paper. And then augmenting individuals alone or in a group plus a layer on top of that would be kind of an amazing super intelligence, I think.
Yeah. And what got me really interested in machine learning, probably 2014, thereabouts, I've been thinking a lot about this idea of, our new networked world. And then the idea of like, how are we going to build the human colossus? And I immediately said, well, machine learning would be really, really helpful in doing that. And you made the point, though, about dropping the single person with some AI enhancements. I love that because it's reminiscent of Bucky Fuller said that you shouldn't call somebody like dumb or smart. You should say they're either tuned in or not tuned in. And so he used the example of the microscopic world. And he said, before the microscope, we had no idea that there was this entire world there. And then we invented the microscope and voila, we got tuned in to the microscopic world. And I use that same analogy with AI. You say we could have it so that we can hear all of the frequencies or we can see all of the light spectrum. That alone to me is like, that is going, talk about superpower. Yeah. Can you imagine being able to hear what a bat can hear or to navigate by? There are so many use cases here that I just find so exciting. And like, it's sort of endless what we can do. And let's bring it back to creativity though, because, in the piece that you wrote for Every, you were basically saying, that what we really need here is the ability to contextualize, and I always think of David Bohm's the implicate order and the explicate order. I don't know if you're familiar with Bohm, but he was out there quantum physicist. He got black. There's a great story because he was Oppenheimer was his mentor, and then it came about that that Bohm had joined the Communist Party, and the whole thing about Oppenheimer blackballing him because he wrote this brilliant, he was a quantum physicist, and he wrote this brilliant thesis called The Implicate Order. And essentially, Oppenheimer was like, if we can't prove his thesis wrong, we just have to say, we have to make sure that everyone thinks poorly of him, the man, ad hominem. And so I did a little thread on Twitter saying, yeah, basically the smartest people in the world in the 1940s was watch the movie Mean Girls, and you'll get an idea of how they did that. But I want to ask about that because we do, as humans, we do have all of these other. I think that we're fundamentally emotionally governed, and I think that the king or queen emotion is fear, especially fear of the unknown. And evolutionarily speaking, that makes a lot of sense, right?
Yeah.
We are all the descendants of the people who ran away.
Yeah.
Right? And so how do you think, will we evolve more rapidly? Have you read The Weirdest People in the World?
No, I'm going to now, though.
That's a great book because he makes the case that and he uses as his example reading. It turns out when you take fMRIs of a human brain of a highly literate person, the part of the brain that used to be given over to visual acuity, right, is colonized to learn how to read. When you look at the actual shape of the human brain of a highly literate person versus an illiterate person, the shape of the brain is actually different. And that's this kind of external cultural evolution that happened. And I wonder, given that is kind of the underlying idea, could this enhance human evolution?
I think so. And that's, I mean, in some ways, like saying, yes, well, enhance human evolution is a bold statement. The tricky thing about human evolution is that it's generally slow. I have not read this, but my knee-jerk reaction is that those people maybe had a predisposition that their acuity was a bit better or different, and it made them better readers. It made reading less tiring for them, and so they liked it more, and they did it more. And maybe their brain changed over their lifespan, or maybe their brain was just a little bit different anyway. And then we have, and that could be an evolutionary piece, right? Where, because it takes so long to evolve, I think that, having access to that many books is new. We didn't have millions of years where everybody could read all these things, but we did have different visual tasks and different kinds of ways of maybe manipulating small objects or building small things with beads and things that really required this great visual acuity to be there. So I think that with AI, we can think of it as, I call it an evolutionary boost, right? So evolution is going to take a very long time. We're not going to be able to sort of wait that out, or I'm not going to be able to in my lifetime. But what if we take the places where I know we have evolutionary shortcomings and we say, aha, we can take technology and kind of, I think about it as like patching a hole of that. One of these is our attention, right? Like we have very limited attention systems on purpose. And so attention's main role is really or there's a few, but one of them is to alert you to danger. So you have this sort of like bottom-up attention, like there's a snake coming at you, you're alone in this scary place, look at the snake quickly. And then we have more of like a top-down attention, this goal-directed attention where there's all these famous experiments where you miss the gorilla running by, right? Where we get focused on a thing and we don't really perceive the rest of the stuff going on in a scene. And so that's great because it computationally allows us to deal with the world. Like if we took every image that comes across our retina, every saccade we make, every little eye movement, and we try to compute all of that anew, we would be lost. We couldn't do anything else. We'd be totally dysfunctional. Our brains would have to be so much larger, and we couldn't come out of the birth canal. It would be terrible. And so we came up with these mechanisms, meaning evolution, but we can actually try and fill some of these holes now. Because we don't, like, if we can take the technology and say, okay, you can't possibly attend to all of the stuff you're reading, right? Like you got bits and pieces of it here and there. And you did a good job because what you remember now, like if I read this book now, I'll remember the things that are relevant today, right? My attentional system will make sure that I unless I'm you, I guess, where I can remember most of the things that I see, right? Like, my attention system will narrow that, but there's a bunch of stuff in the book that might be relevant in 5 years. Say I'm working on another problem, and unless I can make that bridge in my mind and say, oh, right, Bullstrom was talking about this 5 years ago, this specific piece of this, and I wonder if he thought about some other things, and go back and look them up. It's hard for me to do that. So I think we can say, great, and part of what I'm thinking about a lot, right, is like, don't worry about your attention so much, right? Like, do your reading, do what's natural to you as a human. And then what we're doing is storing all of that for you for when it's relevant and it's connected for you, right? But there's so many other ways we can get past this evolutionary ceiling that we've hit. And it's really memory constraints, attentional constraints. We have capacity constraints in terms of how many things we can really keep in mind at once. And so it's about 4. And so when we talked about, we could have the machine go and do all these computations that come up with millions of ideas and just like, grind away and iterate. We can't really do that as machines because we can't keep all of the stuff in mind. And so we already made our own evolutionary boost by creating pens and papers and computers to write things out on and kind of externalize the things in our mind we can't hold. And so we've already done some of these things, but I think there's a lot of room there to say, look at where the gaps are evolutionarily, see if we have a technology or a thing that we can use to fill that. And then we have this amazing, we lose all of the constraints really that we've grown with.
Yeah. And in the same book, The Weirdest People in the World, he spends a lot of time on cumulative cultural evolution. Yeah. And basically this idea that Robert Anton Wilson called books and the printing press the first instance where we humans were able to time bind our ideas and send them into the future. And I always liked that very much because the idea that really prior to that, we had monks, I guess, writing out the scrolls, and we had the library at Alexander with all of the various scrolls, but we didn't have a convenient, relatively inexpensive way to time bind ideas and push them into the future. And now, we're in the catbird seat, in my opinion, because we not only have that, but we have all of these additional ways. I love your idea of patching at the evolutionary mistakes, because that it's like, what was the joke, the Douglas Adams joke, that reading Darwin proved to him that God had an inordinate fondness for beetles. Which I always thought was really funny. But there are these things, and I think that this too is one of the things that ignites the fear in people. Like everybody wants things to improve, but nobody likes change, right? And I think that another David Deutsch quote is that I think is really illustrates the problem that a lot of people have. Is he asks, what were physicists thinking and saying about the internet and quantum physics in 1900? They weren't saying anything about it because we hadn't invented it. We hadn't come up with the explanations yet. And I think that we have this default bug in human OS that we know everything there is to know. And that's going to be bad because we already know. And of course, we don't know. And I think, what did Edison say? We don't know 0.5% of 1% about anything. And so when you speculate, ideally, when you have Recollect built and everybody's using it, hopefully I'm using it as well. What do you see as what'll be the first order effects in thinking, in creativity, et cetera? What's it going to really supercharge?
Yeah. So it is available. I let people on sort of one by one right now, but people could try it. The first order effect.
I'm putting my hand up here for anyone who's just listening to us. I would love to try it.
Yeah, I feel like I have like each piece of what you just said, I'm holding in my mind, and I only have 3 slots here. I'm like, oh no, I'm going to lose one of them. Working memory is terrible. The first order effects of this, right? So you talked about, oh, now we have this like readily available knowledge, really, right? Which we didn't have before, and it's all over the place. And that was a big revolution, with the internet and things. So what we're doing is kind of capitalizing on that piece of it to an extent and saying, great, you have access to all of this information, but access and meaningful usage of it are very different, right? I can access the library right now at NYU and I get everything that they have, but that doesn't mean I know anything from that. And so I think the first order effects really are sort of like delivering on this just-in-time information promise that was supposed to be the internet in a sense. And then really pushing people to, I think of it sort of like a staircase. And when I talk to like early customers, they're like, oh my gosh, if you could just give me access, like it would be amazing. Everything's lost, it's siloed, I can't find it. And we did that. And we're like, here's your access, right? And they're like, oh my gosh. But it really is a staircase, because then they're like, what do I want to think about? What do I need to do with this, right? So there's this sort of like, now what? And I think that's the next phase, is really taking all of this data that we have now. Some people get on with like 40,000 articles, like it's a ton of data. But taking all of that and being able to reflect back to you, kind of where we talked about these evolutionary gaps, right? Like we have all of these things that we do unconsciously that we really can never access meaningfully. How do we use that information to help you do your creative work in a better way, right? So if we can tell that like some of the stuff you're reading is putting you in a bad emotional state, can we reflect that back to you in a way and give you materials to help shift your state? And we can, right? So I think the biggest change right now is understanding that like we waved our magic wand, we give people the superpower, and then they're like, now I have to figure out how to do this work with access to all of this stuff whenever I need it. And like, what am I actually trying to think about? And what do I need to do to get there? And you said something about scientists that I thought was very interesting before I think that was the third slot in my head. But, as a scientist by training, like we're trained really to think nothing is true. It's always going to be disproven. And the best thing you can do in science is disprove something, because we learn something from that. It's really, when I first got into this gig, I was like, oh, I'm going to know everything. I'm going to know all the true things. I'm going to discover. And I think the farther you get down that path, you realize it's really the inverse. You know less and less and less, and nothing is true anymore. You could tell me tomorrow we could breathe water, and I'd be like, well, that was weird. Why'd we think not? That didn't.
I could not agree with you more. And the scientific method essentially, I think an author that I was reading, he said it was the original punk rock ethos. Like, no, that's not true. That's wrong. And the whole point of it is to learn by disproving, right? And you can't even call it a real thesis if it can't be disproven, right? That's pretty self-evident. And you just have this, what seems to be, from a layman like myself's perspective, people want to do the opposite, right? They want it to say, no, this is true. Science proves this to be true. No. That's not the way the scientific method works.
Right. But we want this certainty, right? Going back to this like scary super intelligent, we want to know what's happening. We want to feel like we have this. And when we don't, it is unnerving. But it's also kind of a superpower if you take that mindset and then you become something else, right? Like I transitioned to being an entrepreneur, and I'm like, really, anything's possible. If I can think about like how maybe this could, I'm like, probably we could try it, right? You get this experimental kind of push to it. And it drives some people nuts, because they're like, well, make the decision. This should be happening. And I'm like, it could, or it could be different. We're going to have to look. And so it's a very interesting shift, I think, in terms of knowledge, like all of these. I love that you call these sort of like time boxed or time bound ideas from people, because if you reread a lot of these things, I think if we could take a level up, abstract a level up, right? A lot of the details are wrong. We've proved them wrong later, science or otherwise, philosophy, government, all of these. But there are threads in there that are right. right? Like some piece of that idea still resonates with Plato and all of these really, really ancient thinkers now, because they had no idea, like you said about the internet, they didn't know what this was going to look like. But they did pull a piece out, and we can build on that piece, I think, over time too. And we don't prove maybe that specific thing wrong, but like all the details around that can change, I think, a lot.
Yeah, I think there's the idea that like over time, maxims, for example, maxims are essentially the compression of ideas over time, right? And they compress and compress and compress and compress, getting rid of all of the stuff that was wrong, right? Usually, many times not, because a lot of maxims aren't true. But I also like your idea that you talked about at length in your every article, the idea of the generating of new ideas, the divergent thinking, and then bringing it back to let's focus on the useful, which is convergent. And the author Howard Bloom calls that fission fusion thinking, which I really, really like, because you've got to explore widely, but then you also have to bring it back in, because if you're just always out here, you're never going to get right to the nub of that great new idea.
Yeah. I think
so. No, please.
Oh, just on that note about the weirdos, right? I think we have each individual can think divergently, right? And then we have some people that seem to think more divergently than others, and we label them as weirdos, and maybe they don't meet some social. I self-identify as a weirdo, so when you said the title, I was like, oh no. But I think with that though, when we converge as a society, right? And we try to pull out the thread of this thing. And some of the like weirdo branches break off along the way, or threads, sub-threads of this. But I think also there are fundamentally different directions we can take with that. And so like, I think my hope is like, as people do get exposure to more and more ideas, as people do this sort of divergent thinking, the convergence could be, oh, I need to not just go totally off the rails and just like putter around forever. Like, I'm going to do something with this, right? And that's sort of like the sort of philosopher, scientist, and an engineer, right? Like when you feel like you've got something moving, you could test it, and then can you make it real? But I guess I'm sort of advocating that, like, individually, I think we need to do this to keep ourselves on track and don't wander completely off. And when we don't do that successfully, we often get labeled as weirdo too. So if you don't converge on some of the social norms well enough, right, like, then you really don't get to sort of do all the other kinds of converging with these ideas, or sort of, work with the pack. And these are really sort of people that are very, very divergent, maybe. But I think all of these ideas come to play when we think about individual intelligence and the way that we think creatively, collective intelligence and the way that we think, and then time. All of these people that were sort of reading their ideas, I think of those as conversations with those people. So if I'm conversing with somebody who bound their idea in 1930, like I get to interact. They don't get to hear me talking, but I get to hear them. And I feel like all three of those things have to come together in the right way for us to move somewhere forward without anyone knowing, right, again, to this uncertainty, where we're going. Like, we're going to create where we're going. There is no predetermined place. And so we're sort of marching forward with these loose set of criteria right now.
Yeah. And of course, that is the hallmark of complex adaptive systems, right, is that emergence comes from below. It doesn't come from this sort of top-down order, right? And I believe that one of the things that's happening is, and maybe a little quicker than I would have guessed, is we're moving from what I would call a normally distributed society to one of a chaotic normal distribution. Normal distribution, Brownian motion, I'm sure everyone listening knows about that. The 60 whatever 8% in the middle, that's what everything's designed for. That's like where all the thinking is and all of that sort of thing. And in the Mandelbrot sense of a chaotic distribution pattern, it's very peaky middle. So it's not a 68% distribution. It's quite a bit less than that. And it has very long tails. That's the divergent aspect. And so I think that there's where we're moving. I think it's great because that's where all of, or not all, but many of the good ideas come from. But I think you also have to consistently remind yourself of Wittgenstein's idea: don't look for meaning, look for use, right? And I want to find both. But if you can remind yourself, okay, is there a use? Because as you say, like you can get into you get really far out on the tail, and like you'd be a lot of fun to talk to at a cocktail party, but maybe your life is a complete train wreck, right? I think that one of the things that is very interesting and contrary in many respects is we do have this inborn desire for the illusion of certainty. And yet we are also incredibly adaptable species.
Yes.
And so it's like the Louis C.K. joke about Wi-Fi in airplanes. He says the first time you're on a plane and it has Wi-Fi and you're like, this is the most miraculous thing in the world. I can't believe it. I'm 30,000 feet above the earth in a tin can, and yet I can log on and argue with people on Twitter. And he goes, and then the minute it fails, you go, what the fuck?
Yeah.
So I do think that our adaptability will see us through, and our ability as a species to, really incorporate all of that into our daily routine, etc. But I find it really fascinating, this initial reluctance and fear, and then the tipping point gets reached, and oh yeah, of course I love that. So what do you think, like 7 years, 10 years from now, and you're on version whatever 7.0? What's that version? Just speculate for me. What's that version of Recollect look like?
Yeah, I think it looks much closer to the cyborg idea. I actually, when I started Recollect, was very interested in this idea of bringing in some sort of brain-computer interface and taking that information, using that, really threading that into the models. And this was back in 2019, and no one cared about AI. They cared even less about neuroscience and brain-computer. And so I feel like as a first-time founder, I was like, well, I'm never going to get funding, so I should probably create the beginning of this, and then hopefully the world catches up with this idea. And so I think in, 7-ish years here, my vision for this really is that we do bring that in, right? I think we'll bring it in before the 7 years, but we bring in this biometric data. We bring in all of the stuff that we know about what you know. We bring in what we learn about what's going on with you. What are your goals? What are you trying to accomplish in the world on a day-to-day basis? What are your intentions? And I think if we can bring those three things together, we can and I think what we all need to do is sort of throw away this idea that machines are deterministic at all anymore. I think that's the big shift with AI, honestly. And so we use all of those things to adaptively create your experience with these machines. And so whatever you're doing is generated based on this information, based on what's going on with you in the moment. Are you feeling stressed, right? Are you really focused, right? Like there's all of these dimensions we can pull in. We can thread those through the models, and then we can really say, okay, we can infer that your goal is to record this podcast. We bring up something that allows you to see each other in this space. And we change the lighting to be in the right way for you, whatever works best for your mood and this conversational tone here, right? We bring information into the side if we need it, or little cues. If I'm forgetting the name of an author of a book, that sort of slides in for me. But I think what we've got is the base work for all of this sort of contextual, and really not just language contextual, but human contextual data. And then if we decide that our operating systems are no longer deterministic, and I don't think they should be, and I don't think we'll have rectangles very much longer, that we can just generate it. It doesn't have to be the same for you. It doesn't have to be the same for me. It doesn't have to be the same when I wake up in the morning. It could be totally different. And we can hook into a lot of the ways that we actually do think and our minds actually do work that are not like fighting with this. So putting information in the same place all the time, right? Like if you need to remember something virtually, that should just go in the same place that it makes sense for you. And that could be different again for you than it could be for me. But that's sort of the future that I see for Recollect, is pushing this boundary of, can we really, we already have a sort of cyborg idea, but can we push it farther, and can we take the technology that already exists right now and change people's minds a little bit, right? So there is this uncertainty. Is this sort of, we saw this when we first launched Recollect, the very first version of it we launched, people could not get past the fact that they weren't doing like this word plus this word. And I'm not sure they still, right now they can type whatever they're thinking. And I'm like, type a sentence, type a paragraph. I don't care. Just tell me what you're thinking. Give me your thoughts. And they really struggle with that as an interaction. And I think that, some of the stuff, if we can make it more invisible, more adaptive, and more personalized, like it will be so much easier to adopt the stuff that's coming. I think is pretty, maybe not obvious, but like I think some of these things will definitely happen.
Totally agree. And one of my hypotheses has been that we are moving not just the broad economy from mass production to mass customization. We are moving everything to mass customization, which is what you're really doing, which is why I was fascinated by your article and what you're doing. Because how cool, when I see it, I'm just like, how cool is that? Because we are out of this idea that one size fits all. It certainly does not. We are very cognitively diverse. And I look at cognitive diversity as a massive benefit as opposed to some sort of liability, right? The more cognitively diverse people that you can bring, or machines that you can bring into a problem or a creation, I think the better. And so I also love the idea that, and I agree with you, it's got to be almost invisible.
Yeah.
Right. Because if it's not, it gets very difficult for the human to, incorporate it into just their daily routine. Do you have any like tricks that you're trying to? I don't mean tricks. Any procedures or use cases or project flow that work towards that idea of making it as invisible as possible?
Yeah, I think the way it's more of a framework for developing these types of things right now. It's that the invisible piece of that will be when it's more intuitive. So when you're not calling on this thing, right? When in Recollect, you're not writing down what you're thinking. When we're taking this information in the background and we're putting it together and we're intuiting, oh, this is the thing right now for you, right? That's the invisible piece. The first part of that, though, to build those kinds of models is getting the explicit piece without it being clunky. And that's the design, like, needle you really is hard to thread in making these kinds of products, because you need this underlying data to build a model for how that works. And you don't want to have somebody sitting there, like, God forbid, clicking through like a million checkboxes and trying to guess it, right? So I think I don't think I fully solved this, but this is sort of where I'm heading right now, which is, if it's going to be invisible, right, it has to feel like you, but better. And it can't feel like I'm like, yeah, I got to type all this stuff and I don't even know what I'm doing right now. And so I think that I hope that's where lots of people start heading. And I am a person that's fairly neurodivergent. Like, I'm divergent in all these different measures, and I would love, and part of this creating this is selfish as well, I think, for lots of founders. But if we could create these very personalized experiences for people that match the way they work, right? And they allow them to thrive and create this abundance in the world, rather than, it's like when we wouldn't let people write left-handed, like that's, I'm old enough that was true, right? But if we sort of move away from that, but then we also have, almost going back to this idea of like, can we communicate with the dog or the whale, right? Like, if we can find a middle ground of this information, where, like, a lens where, like, if I'm having trouble communicating an idea because I'm kind of all over the place and this other person is more steadied, can we create a middle layer of that too with this, where it's like, I've done these things, I'm putting it together, I have my whole world personally that makes sense to me. You don't have to come sit in it with me and like really understand it. But can we also then help you take all that stuff? Right now we have what we call playgrounds, which are infinite canvases. You can put your ideas on there and you can move them around and kind of think spatially, which I think is important for people. But if someone else looks at my playground, they're like, this is wacky bananas. Like, I don't know how you navigate this. It's like a desk full of papers, right? And I'm like, well, you got to go over here. And like, dim light, sometimes people are like, I don't know what this is. And I'm like, oh, you're right. It is really hard for someone else who's not in my brain to use. So I like, my hope too is that we can say, okay, we let you be neurodivergent. You're perfect the way you are. And we're going to help you to get to that communication with another human so we can all coordinate better, right? Like I can actually get my idea over to you on this podcast or to people out listening, and they can follow it. And they're not like, I don't know where we left off.
Yeah. And that is what I find most attractive about what you're doing. I think that if, the biggest challenge with communication is the assumption that it took place, right? And if we can use our various innovations and tech to make that coordination of communication more understandable to people of very different neural types, boy, that's going to be very helpful. And I maybe this is just aspirational, but I definitely think that projects like yours and others that I've seen, some I've invested in, that a lot of them are moving towards this ability to better coordinate the way we humans communicate with each other. I mean, just that alone would be such an unlock, in my opinion. Yeah,
it would be for me too. I feel like, especially as a founder and working on sort of an esoteric area, right? Even if we could build something that allows other people to, read this article or I wrote or the podcast or something, and they understand it enough to find me, right? Like that's even just the basic. We don't have to coordinate on anything, but like having a beacon out there where they're like, oh, hey, I had a thing. That would be beautiful, right? Like I feel like I would get so much out of that even.
Exactly. I totally agree. Yeah, completely on a different subject. What was it like going from academia to being a founder?
Well, I had a big stint in the middle there where I worked at different tech companies. So when I left academia, it was a fascinating time. So it was 2013-ish, and data science had just become a role. And I had spent like 10 years at that point collecting data from humans very arduously, right? Having them sit in the lab, sit in the fMRI scanner. Oh my gosh, setting up the EEG caps, like just hours of my life to collect very little data respectively. And so when somebody told me, hey, and I focus on attention, right? Like my study was around how do we perceive scenes? How do we take all this information and make it computationally possible? And so when I made the shift, I was very nervous to go to industry because I didn't know what it meant as an academic. But I was also fascinated because we were hitting a time where I could get data from millions of people and I didn't have to put them in a chair. I didn't have to do really anything. And like explaining that, I went to Yahoo first back then, and explaining that to the people with such excitement and saying, oh my God, do you realize you have all of this data? You know what they're doing. You know what they saw. You have so much information for free. And like kind of pushing that across. And like, the negative side of that for me was I didn't fully understand coming from academia to industry. I think a lot of people, when I walked onto the scene as this weirdo from academia, were like, oh, you can help us and train people's attention forever. And it took me a minute to really realize that, like, because I could, right? Like I understood the degree of visual angle between items that was best, right? Like, how do you activate these different kinds? Where do your eyes need to be? All of that information I understood. And when I realized that, I thought like, oh no, it's like, I don't want this for people. Like, I don't want you to endlessly scroll your recipe app. That sounds really sad and dystopian to me. And it was the wrong objective function, really, right? We were pushing towards advertising, like, how do we monetize this as much as possible? And when I figured that out, I left that forever and did other work in data science, right? Like, I took a bunch of different roles. And then the last role I had was with a really beautiful group here in Brooklyn in a converting garage down the street called Fast Forward Labs. And it was a bunch of academic expats, and we were your nerd best friends. And we would help people back then with deep learning, right? So they were collecting all this data, and they'd done the big data thing, and it was their oil, and they were very excited. And my job was to come and imagine what they could do with it and how they would technically accomplish that. And that was really fun. But at some point I decided, and it was around 7 years-ish, maybe a little more. So I thought of Vivian again. This is all great, but I would love to work on the thing that I want to see that's true in the world, not necessarily whoever is paying for having a nerd best friend around. And so I really, I had great support from people, which was awesome. The founder of Fast Forward Labs is Hilary Mason, and she was really supportive too of like, it's a great idea. Go ahead. And so again, with that sort of person saying like, you could do this thing, I was able to shift my mindset again and say, oh, okay, so I was an academic, then I was a data scientist, machine learning engineer person. And now I can be a founder, which is a totally different skill set, kind of. Because having done all these things in industry, I'd gotten to understand, okay, how do you build products effectively? How do you lead an engineering team? Like, I treated that period sort of as like a second, maybe very long postdoc, but like, how do you learn to industry well? And then you could take those two things and put them together and say, great, now I've got the skill sets, and I learned a ton working for other people and figuring out what they needed. And then I could apply it to what I wanted to be true. So, I'm not quite 7 years, or maybe not even to the midpoint. Anyway, I'm not 7 years into this journey as a founder yet. But I think the transitions have been some of the more interesting parts of my life, where I decided, okay, I think I understand what this is, and I'm ready. And all of it gets to come back together in these threads over time. And so, yeah, who knows what the one after this looks like? I don't know.
Very, very cool. And you mentioned something that I ran into a lot when talking in very excited terms about the potential of AI. And that would be people, so you can sell more ads. And I would look at them and I would say, just because the first gen maximized the objective function for revenue doesn't mean we can't maximize the objective function for creativity, for innovation, for a whole variety of other things. And it was really interesting because I mentioned Bucky Fuller. You could see instantly the people who tuned in when they heard that. They're like, oh, of course. Right, of course. And so I think what you're doing is absolutely fascinating. I want to pay really close attention to you. I would love to get a chance to be one of the chosen to give it a try. And if you've listened to other episodes of the podcast, you know that we end it with a question where we're going to make you the Empress of the world. You can't kill anybody. You can't put anyone in a re-education camp. But we do have a magical microphone that we're going to hand to you. And you can speak two things into it. And you will incept all 8 billion people on the planet for whatever their morning is, whenever they wake up. They're going to think that the two things that you spoke into that microphone were their own ideas. And they're going to say, I've just had the greatest idea, and I'm actually going to act on it. What two things are you going to incept?
Yeah. And so they're not fully formed ideas I'd like to incept. I did think about this for a minute before I got on. One of them would be, if you're looking around the world and you're like, oh, I don't have enough in any capacity, like really thinking, flipping that around for a second and thinking, what do I have? And taking an account of that will let you open up to feeling sort of comfortable. I feel like as humans, we always want more of things, right? We want to be like on the treadmill, on a thing. And so I think we could accomplish a lot if we kind of let that go. And then we say, wow, look at all the stuff I have. I have friends and family and everybody's relatively healthy right now, right? So I think that was one big thing. And then the other I wanted to incent people with is just, it's sort of a weird idea I get sometime in my head where I'm like, every human is on Earth for about the same amount of time, give or take, right? There's things that happen. And we all end up in very different places, right? We end up doing very different things. We end up in different socioeconomic classes, and all of these things happen. But we're really all here, like Joe Biden and I are on the same planet, right? Maybe I'm not as old as Joe Biden yet, but right, but I'm not the president. I don't want to be the president. But when I think about that as sort of like, if I could insert this in someone's head and be like, who are you looking at and saying, oh gosh, they're doing this amazing thing, right? We talked about all these wonderful authors, right? And if you think about that and you go, well, what would I have to change to get there, right? Like if I assume blank slate, we could all just level this thing, what would I actually have to do? And this has been incredibly helpful for me, I think, throughout. And so I would love for other people to just, wherever you're at in life, whatever you look like, whatever you act like, whatever's going on for you, wherever you started, you do have some control of popping over to another path. If you just think about us all as humans, that we're all here for about the same amount of time.
I love that, because you are not on path dependency is an important thing to take into consideration, but that doesn't mean you can't step off that path. Which I love that idea, because if more people thought that way, there'd be a lot more people actually stepping off that well-worn path and blazing one of their own. Well, Alice, this has been absolutely fascinating. You are a joy to talk to. Where can people find out more about your company, about you?
So we're on Twitter, I think at Recollect, and then our website is re-collect.ai. I hope I got that right. But maybe we can put it in the show notes if I didn't.
We will check for and make sure it's right in the show notes.
Perfect. Yeah. So we're on Twitter, and we have our website. If you want to get on the wait list, I think there's still a place where you can mention that you listen to the podcast, so I can look for you and try to get you off the wait list as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alice, and best of luck with this. I think it's a really great project, and I wish you great success with it.
Thank you.